Matthew 6 and Luke 11 hold a parallel metaphor and passage of Scripture that talks about the eye and the lamp, light and dark, and the condition of the soul, that have some differences and similarities that when we look at them exegetically, and we look at them in history, and we look at the passages with a full context of Scripture, and try to apply it to today, might change the way we look at it. Particularly, I want to look at a couple key features, one being the extramission versus intramission understanding of the scientific eye, and the other being the application for all believers, and how this applies to all believers, even with a slightly different scientific understanding of the eye. So we're going to get started, and the first thing we're going to look at is just a parallel side-by-side with a few key things pointed out. If you look at this passage of Scripture, you'll see the yellow, the similar wording and the similar metaphors written out, the first two verses, though they have some differences that we'll address here in a few slides, really similar in the way that they're worded. The eye is the lamp of the body, the eye is the lamp of your body, taking careful that if your eye is bad or not single or in part, and so watch out that the light within you is not darkness, but when your eye is bad, your body is full of darkness, right there. One of the key differences that I want to look at while we have them in parallel is this last verse, Luke 11:36. The last verse of this passage in Luke is not included in Matthew. A couple scholars have looked at whether this is a redactionary method on Matthew's account, different source documents in general, whether it's just superfluous wording that Matthew decided it wasn't needed, or whether there's a different reason why Luke has this extra passage or exhortation at the end. We'll look at a couple key metaphorical differences as well later, like the difference between the optimism of Luke versus the pessimism of Matthew, the exhortation versus the warning that's included in these sections. But I think a key thing to look at when you look at them in parallel is that these two are really similar metaphors, spoken at different times in the gospel account. Matthew 6 being on the Sermon on the Mount towards the beginning of Jesus' ministry, and Luke 11 being sandwiched between two Pharisee addressing sections, one at a dinner table and one with questions, kind of hostile questions before, about the condition of the soul in the Jewish culture. So looking at those two side by side, we see very similar, a few key differences that we'll look at. The next thing we are going to look at in this is the direct comparison between the two. We're going to see a couple of key features that I think are important that I want to address in the next few slides. The first of these, actually, I want to skip down to two. One of the key differences I notice is that Matthew's account concludes with a warning about darkness and watching out for the darkness in your soul and being careful that your whole soul is not wholly dark, whereas Luke's account concludes with an exhortation about light. Luke's account says, therefore, if your whole body is full of light, and it kind of encourages the believer, versus Matthew ends by saying, if the light is darkness. So more of a warning that, hey, look out, this is a possibility. So Luke's account concludes with an exhortation, whereas Matthew's account concludes with a warning. Matthew's account has this implication, along with that pessimistic attitude that Matthew kind of holds, that says, hey, if the light within you is darkness. This particular phrasing of the light and the dark and the eye and the soul isn't in Luke's account, saying, hey, this light, not necessarily good or evil, but this idea of whatever's inside of you, or this lamp, and we're going to talk about that in a second with extramission of the eye, but this thing that is happening with your eye has the possibility to be dark. And so the thing that could be coming out of your eye, or the thing that could be emitting from your eye, might be dark, so take heed. Luke, like we already said, contains an extra verse, and those are the main differences that I want to point out. The similarities, though, if you just read through the passages, the phrasing is almost word for word all the way through, except for those key differences, the eye being the lamp of the body. They both have this metaphor of the condition of that eye, or the condition of that lamp, affects the state of the moral and spiritual being. So the inside being is affected by that eye and by that lamp inside of you. And so they're illustrating the condition of the soul. They're both pointing out that, hey, the soul inside of you, whether looking at the Jew or the Greek, the soul that you have, that truth that you seek, the inner being, there's a light and a dark way to be. And Jesus is proclaiming, hey, I've got a light way to be that's really, really good if you follow me. All right, so let's get into some historicity. Two key features. These are the things that I said I really wanted to hit. I think that these are two of the main features that pop out about this passage to me is the scientific understanding of the eye. the philosophical perspective on light, particularly in the first century, in the Greco-Roman world, in the city-state world, where they were learning about science and developing new scientific techniques, and how emission or extra emission of light was the scientific understanding of how the eye worked. I also want to look at Jewish thoughts on light, dark, and the soul, and show that it's not just biblical Jewish, but even extra biblical documents from the Dead Sea Scrolls verify that Jesus' addressal of light and dark is not just for the Jew, but for the Gentile. And not just for the Gentile, but for the Jew. So those are the two main things I want to hit there. We'll start with the emission theory, or extramission. Both kind of mean the same thing. Some other variants are even extromission. But it's just this idea that the visual perception of the eye is accomplished by eye beams, kind of like you can see in this old picture, eye beams emitted by the eyes, so that the human eye emitted beams and they reflected off of an image, and that's how we were able to see the image. So the eye was emitting something, the eye was putting out something, kind of like a lamp, which is what this kind of passage is about. But the eye is emitting a thing from it, and that's allowing us to see. I also think it's important to note that expressions in the Old Testament have, Jews thought the eye had its own light as well. So this isn't just a new scientific understanding. This is just a general world consensus of, hey, this is how the eyes work. The eyes emit something, and that's why when you're blind, you're missing that ability to emit. So it'll be way different than what we understand today, where the eyes are more receptors and the light is an external source somewhere. But I think that extramission has some implications on the metaphor and how we apply it today that might change a preaching. If I were to preach this one day, it might change a preaching of it to be more in line with what the metaphor was intended to produce in the souls at the time, and what it might have meant to the writers of the texts. Second thing I want to look at is the Jewish reflection on light, dark, eye, soul. In the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Royal Community was a book of Jewish regulations and customs for the community, found in 67 BCE. Talks about walking on paths of light, and that the sons of justice or the prince of light, or these rules are for the people that walk on the path of light, and the angel of darkness is leading us to the path of darkness. And so this idea of light and darkness isn't just for the Platonic thought with, if you think of Plato's cave, it's not just for the Gentile, but it's also for the Jew. This metaphor is applicable to both. Other instances of light, I think while we're talking about Jewish light, that's not necessarily extra biblical. If you think about Moses' radiant face coming down from the mountain, coming from meeting God in the tent, think of the pillars of fire, Psalms 27:1 saying, "The Lord is my light and my salvation." This metaphor of light connecting to the Lord was a pretty common Jewish custom, as well as light being connected to truth, which is pretty common in the Greek or Roman custom. So, looking at that, we've got historical justification for this being a good metaphor for Jesus to use. Now we'll look at the audience and who he was actually talking to. I think the difference between these two audiences in Luke, particularly in Luke 11, is what this is looking at. The audience of Jesus, I tend to agree with what Garrett wrote about it being primarily Jewish in an article. And I tend to agree with him based on the sandwiching of the passage between two very, very Jewish confronting texts, whether it's Jesus dining at a Pharisee's house immediately after, or Jews confronting him about the state of the soul before. And I tend to agree that at least the people who spoke up in the passage in Luke 11 were Jews. Now, were there Gentiles there? Surely. Did they get recorded in the account of Luke? No. Even though Luke might have been writing for Gentiles or Christians in the future, the audience at the time, Jesus' audience, seems to be, at least in response, Jewish. What this means is, now if we rewind and take all those metaphors of eye and the light and the dark and walking on the path of light, and how light reflects God and the Lord is our light. So this metaphor applies to those Jews, and Jesus is speaking on a level that the Jews would say, oh yes, that's what we believe. We believe that goodness comes from light. We believe that these ideas of forgiveness, if you think about the year of Jubilee, or forgiving debts, if you think about generosity and love and purity, and all of these things just talk to the state of the soul. If you think about the state of the soul, Jesus understanding that the Jewish idea of the state of the soul would be connected with light seems to pull this metaphor to the Jewish audience. Now we hop over and take a look at Luke's audience. For the sake of time, we could talk a whole semester about Theophilus, and I could study infinitely about him. We could Scholars have debated for a long time about who Theophilus was. Was he a real person? Was he a metaphor for the lovers of God or the people who might read this or followers of God in Jesus? Some common opinion is that he was a Roman official converted to Christianity who might have needed assurance from his faith from Luke. Other scholarship says that it's nobody and it's just a common term for God lover or a person who loves God or somebody reading this in the Christian church or future Christian church who hears these words and wants to apply them. So I think that's important to talk about first is that, hey, Luke's audience directly stated is Theophilus. It is those lovers of God or a recently converted Christian. But the total audience in writing a letter that you know is going to be propagated, particularly a historical record through Acts, as it relates to Luke, if he intended for them to be dispersed together, both being written to Theophilus, he knows this is going to be read by Gentiles and Jews. He knows it might be confronted by the Jews and it might be accepted by the Gentiles, or it might cause some persecution in the Greco-Roman world, and persecution in the Jewish world. But I would tend to think that Luke, in writing the text, knows his audience might be both. And so that testifies to the ability of writing this metaphor in a way that both cultures could take it in and say, yeah, that's what we believe, and that's going to be fulfilled in what Jesus will later reveal as himself. So he applies a Greco-Roman philosophy to the teaching that maybe Jesus didn't necessarily say explicitly or say uniquely. Jesus didn't mention any allegory of extramission or allegory of the cave or Plato or anything that specifically is Greek. But I would say that Luke knew his audience and knew that as he was writing, there's a potential at least for this to be read by that world. And so the metaphor is more broad. The metaphor applies to both sides and says, hey, that light you're looking for, whether it's that Jewish light of Moses and his radiant face, or that Greek light of the truth and the philosophical truth, the real light outside of the cave that we're looking for, we can find both of those in Jesus. All right, a little bit of context, really just shortly answering the questions, what is the meaning of Jesus actually saying these words in that context? I think that emission theory that we already talked about, the historical scientific view of the eye, kind of indicates a slightly different opinion or a slightly different interpretation of this passage than maybe I've heard taught for most of my life, which is what propagates from the body indicates the state of the soul, not necessarily what takes in. So when I read the word "I" in a 2024 context, I might think, oh, what I'm taking in is what he's talking about here. But Matthew 15:11, much like Jesus would say in other parts where what goes into something's mouth doesn't defile them, talking about food and idols, but what comes out of their mouth, that's what defiles them. This idea of, hey, the things that you're emitting, these are the things that testify to your soul. And we'll talk more about that in a little bit. I think this teaching for all, the idea that Jesus' messages could have been received by Jew and Greek, is important, like we talked about before. And it could still have its intended effect, even if two different people with two completely different worldviews are reading it. So Jesus is meaning specifically, hey, the thing that you're hearing, this thing about me, this thing about the state of your soul being affected by the eye, and this eye being the lamp of the body that needs to emit light, would have been read with its intended effect. And this is just shores up a foundation for spiritual blindness and spiritual clarity. It would have challenged the Jewish teaching that, hey, the Jewish culture is the only one that has spiritual clarity, and invited the Gentiles in. It would have also reassured the Jewish community in as much as it would have said, hey, this thing that we've been preaching, I desire mercy and not sacrifice, this idea of forgiveness and love that permeates the Old Testament, and inviting the outsider into the community would have been the testament to the actual action of forgiveness and love, would have been a testament to spiritual clarity. What you're emitting is a testament to spiritual clarity, not the specific rule that you followed to a T perfectly that Jesus would have. So this foundations, this idea of spiritual blindness and clarity in a new light that invites the Gentiles into this age-old Jewish founded religion that would change the world. So we'll finish off with a modern application for believers. This is kind of the key point. If there's one slide that I think is a testament to what I have learned through looking at this passage in a lot of in historic accounts, looking at this passage word by word, looking at this passage with a new understanding of the scientific view of the time. I think that the gauge of the soul, the gauge of the condition of the soul, is what we produce. That spiritual fruit and spiritual descendants are proof of life, not necessarily what goes into the eye. So what you're emitting is proof of spiritual clarity, or proof of spiritual goodness, or proof of Jesus is what I would claim it as, rather than what you're intaking. And so this is all coming from that idea of extramission versus intramission, and as it changes the interpretation of the passage. Matthew 7, talking about by your fruit you will recognize people. John 14:15, saying, if you love me, you will keep my commands. And James 2:18, saying, I'll show you my faith by my good works. We can see that throughout the canon of Scripture, that this idea of emission is an appropriate way to look at the spiritual condition of the soul. The spiritual clarity, this idea of reflecting and emitting light. The metaphor of light and darkness inspires us as believers. We can look at this light and we can apply it even today. Today we still use this metaphor as something that's good. We say there's goodness or light or truth and beauty. We see this on posters and walls and hallmarks. We see this written on pillows. The metaphor is not lost on us today, just like it wouldn't have been lost on the Jew or the Greek. The metaphor of light still applies to us today, and we can use it as a gauge for our soul. And what's brought to the light, or that idea of if we walk in the light as he is in the light from 1 John, still affects us today in our own interpretation, even if we don't have the scientific understanding or the scientific interpretation that they did in the day. And then lastly, I think the warnings and the exhortations still greatly apply to us today. I think that the warning of Matthew, the warning of take heed lest that light in you be darkness and the whole body be filled with darkness, so then your emissions are all dark or your emissions are all poor fruit, is still very applicable to us today. And I think the exhortation or the encouragement of Luke is really applicable, saying, hey, what great joy it is if you're full of light and you're able to share that light with other people. I think even though our scientific understanding of the light has changed, the purity of the soul has not. And the purity of the teaching of the purity of the soul, or truth, if you want to take it from a Greco-Roman viewpoint, so has not changed. So the Jewish purity of the soul and the Greek purity of the thought, or purity of the reason, the logos, that reason for being, and then even today what we would call a pure heart or a pure soul. All of these things still apply to us today, and we still have an ability to interpret our own hearts by the light that we produce, or the light that we emit through our eyes as the emitting parts of our being. And so what this might look like today in a little bit different application would be, okay, instead of saying, well, what are your eyes emitting? I don't see any laser beams coming out of your eyes. Say, what is your life emitting? What is the fruit that you're producing? What is the spiritual goodness and the spiritual descendants that you're producing? And those are a testament to the soul. Those are not a rubric for the soul, or a rubric for salvation or spirituality or Christianity, but they're a gauge or a meter for what's inside. So Jesus is, in his terminology, if we go back to the very beginning and look at the two texts, where he says the eye is a lamp of the body, or the emission or the emitting of the emissions of the body, or what you produce out of your body, is a lamp of your body. And when those productions are clear, your whole body's full of light. And so I think the encouragement for Luke at the end is super important, just to know that if your whole body's full of light, no part dark, it will be wholly illuminated. That's when the lamp shines its light on you. Just an encouragement from Luke that applies to us today wholly. So thank you for watching this far. I really appreciate it. Have a good day.